I really appreciate our guest today. Jessica Justrabo is the manager of social and health equity at Goodwill Industries here in London. And, Jessica, I've known for a number of years. I got to meet her especially well during the mayor's panel on poverty from a number of years ago. And she has been everywhere and kind of done everything. But the thing I appreciate about the most is that she goes into these kind of obscure areas and the cracks of all where the system is for people of low income or people having trouble accessing programs and helps to move them forward in that point. So I'm really glad you're here with us today, Jessica. Thanks so much for joining us. It's awesome.
That was such a lovely intro. Thank you so much. I appreciate
Well, it
it.
was it was true. So that was good. But it's true. I remember speaking with you years ago. I remember I had just gotten out of politics. I think it was in 2012, maybe 2013, and I was
Wow.
speaking at a Bridges Out of Poverty event down in the
Mhm.
south part of London, and then after that, of course, there was the mayor's panel on poverty, and you came and you helped me to understand a lot of different things during that time. But your title is an interesting one, but I know that you're responsible as well for Circles Out of Poverty, which is mainly where I want to center today. But why don't you just give us a bit about what it is that you do there at Goodwill and probably other places as well?
Sure. So, yeah, as Glenn has mentioned, I guess I'll get serious and take my glasses off. But as Glenn mentioned, and as you, sorry, have mentioned, yeah, I've done a lot of different positions over my time in social services, whether that's at detention centers or working with youth who are struggling with homelessness or precarious employment, adults, newcomers, kind of you name it. And it's been truly a great privilege to support so many individuals. And I really appreciate the job that I have right now because it's a little bit of a combination between what you mentioned, Glenn, around the Circles program and previous, I think around 2017, 2018. Um, we had been called Bridges Out of Poverty Circles, and now we're just Circles London because we do run our training program, which is the Rethink Poverty workshop. So if anybody is interested in a workshop around the issues of poverty, around systemic barriers, and then also how to be a part of those solutions. We've worked with people who have lived experience, with frontline individuals who are working one on one with individuals. And then also, yeah, many different practitioners
Yeah,
that have that focus on poverty.
yeah. One of the things I've always appreciated about you, Jessica, is that you're so much smarter than me on these areas. One of the things I've learned being the director of the food bank for 38 years, along with Jane, is that when we first got started, food banks got started in the recession in the 80s because there were government support programs that were very, very important, right? And they basically kept a lot of people who were on low income from falling out the bottom. But with
Mhm.
that recession, it wasn't happening. There was some real fraying happening around the edges. Food banks got started. And on the food area, we're trying to help out. I know there were other groups helping in other sectors as well for different things for people of low income. But as the decades have gone on, and we've now been through this for 4 decades, the government never fully came back. It didn't come back in the 80s. It didn't come back in the recession in the 90s, right? It didn't come back after 2007, the Great Recession. And it did not come back after the pandemic. So basically, what happened is this is just my view anyway, as the rest of the economy kind of moved ahead and people muddled their way through, and people who were on supports from government were frozen in place during that time while everything else was speeding past them, right? So the
Yeah.
cost of living went up, the cost of food went up, the cost of rent went up. And yet there are still people, more and more people, probably about 60% of the people that come to us as a food bank are people that are in those sectors. Disability, Ontario Works, right? And those numbers are increasing because in truth, they're frozen in place. So an Ontario Works person would get $722 a month, let's say. That's exactly what they were getting a decade ago. And yet, when
Yeah.
you look at the cost of everything else, it's really gone up. So I think what I've always appreciated about you is that you've helped people to navigate that system, which is
Mm.
great. But that system is not the system that was there before, right? It's almost like you're before you just had to navigate, negotiate, learn some skills, and you could get from A to B. But now there's just doors in that whole thing that are closed,
Yeah.
and you can't move past it. I know you've talked recently about how you've appreciated the United Way had their session recently where they talked about these government supports and how they are. But how much more difficult has that changed in government responsibilities? How much has that changed your approach to things, or even your outlook, or even your spirit? Has it been pretty discouraging?
Uh, that is a very complex answer,
Hmm.
but also a very easy answer. I think in I think when we were on the mayor's panel on poverty, it felt like some sort of moment of time where everybody was kind of on the same page. And I think it was back in 2018. We were doing some good work. We were talking about system change, and then I think around 2019, we continued to do that work, and then the pandemic hit. And exactly what you mentioned before, it was like everyone was frozen in time, because the rate of food, the rate of gas, the rate of everything, all of the expenses just shot right up. And
Yeah,
you are exactly right. A single individual will receive $733 a month, um, and that is for basic needs and for shelter. So, you look at how much it costs now with, again, um, rent going up. Nobody can afford to live off of $733. We just had one of our participants speak to CBC Radio about United Way, and their call to double Ontario Works. And she was talking about her budget. She did out her budget right then and there, for Kate Dubinsky. And Kate was just astounded. Like, how would you be able to manage on that? And the tricky thing is people will say, and they'll argue, well, you're not supposed to stay on Ontario Works forever. And that's absolutely true. Just like you say, you're not supposed to use the food bank forever. But that is in an idealistic world where people are not constantly thinking in their mind, okay, well, how much money do I have today? And how much, and the mental labor that takes. And just like you said, the navigation of poverty in the city. We are a resources rich city. There are so many social agencies to support people with housing stability, with, the Housing Stability Bank as well, with extra supports for rent and for arrears and all those types of things, but also for food. I always say, there's so many food programs in the city of London, but it is the navigation that you have to get from one place to the next place with your kids, especially in the winter time, getting on the bus with your boxes and your bags and everything full of everything, and telling your story over and over and over. It is so difficult. And now, the government is kind of, with Ontario Works, they're changing the system in some ways.
yeah,
Whether those changes are good or bad, we'll have to see. But from the very preliminary things that we are seeing right now, resources are being reallocated in ways that, for instance, there's less money supporting people for bus passes. There's less money supporting people for employment related expenses. And I can't tell you whether that's, our municipality's decision or the provincial government's uh, decision, but the provincial government has given a lot of new mandates around life stabilization for municipalities, as well as how we disperse Ontario Works. And it hasn't gone up. And that is why United Way is saying,
yeah,
listen, we have to double these rates. People are walking around, completely stressed. Mental health is at an all time high, especially after COVID. Sorry, to answer your question, I said it was complex because of all of the things I just mentioned, but it is very simple. We are all tired. People who are working front lines, I can tell you the stories that we hear. We were able to help people navigate systems, I would say, better in 2019 and 2020. Now it is so difficult, and
Yeah.
it feels very grim, honestly. Um,
Back when
yeah.
I was an MP, 20 2006 to 2011, I would often come back to London and meet with various funders and other groups. That included governments. And always there was this favorite thing that they threw out there. There's too much duplication, right? There's too
Mm,
much duplication of social services in our city. And, they're overrunning the system, so it needs to be trimmed up, it needs to be worked on. And of course, I would sit there and say, look at the reason why there's all of these groups is because governments did cut back on these supports, not just federally, not just provincially, but also locally. There were groups that
yeah.
suddenly overnight saw their funding was gone. So other community groups will come together and try to do what they can. Or a group like Goodwill will suddenly, start diversifying even more to move out into those areas to try to be able to help people. But I heard it again even yesterday, where somebody who's a funder was telling me, Glenn, there's just so many groups out there. And the problem is that it didn't used to be that way. We didn't used to have food banks or those kind of things when government assumed the responsibility for people who had fallen
Mhm.
through the cracks. And I always bristle a bit when I hear that argument about duplication. It's just a community trying to respond. Are there a lot of
Mhm.
groups trying to do that? Absolutely, there are, because there's a lot of people right across the city that are really struggling, sorry, and trying to get through it. And I just think, I don't know how you manage that. Like we go to South Sudan, for instance, every year and have to get
Mhm.
through all the mechanisms of bureaucracy and everything else to just try to get to the place that we want to. And it's frustrating, but we only have to do it for 2 weeks a year. You, on the other hand, 24 hours a day are trying to help people navigate a social system that's not sensitive to where they're at. And
Mhm.
also a community system that's so complex with so many options of things that people have to go to that it must get confusing for them. Does it get confusing for you?
Absolutely. What I hear a lot is when you explain to individuals who are asking for help, you say, okay, well, you can go here and they can give you this. You can go here and they can give, and they'll say to me, I didn't know that this existed, or I didn't know about this pocket or that support. And I agree. We do have so many supports, but exactly what you said, it is a community's response
Yeah.
to funders, offering only maybe 2, 4, 5 years. And then after those 2, 4, or 5 years, obviously we need to be sustainable. We can't continue in a way where we're constantly asking for funders for those monies to continue on with the supports. But it's so difficult. I have seen this happen, and I think I'm finally at the point in my career where I can look back and say, this was happening then, and I've seen this then. But I feel as though every 4 years, the government says, hey, you know what? I think that we should change the system to blank, or we should
Mhm.
disperse this money to this population group or this population group. And yes, of course, they have research, they have to back that up, but I think what happens is that we are never focused on long term change. We are only focused on the next 4 years. And I understand that politicians have to they have to weigh that, obviously. You have to get voted back in so that you can continue that long term change. But really, it's so difficult for those who are on the ground doing the work, trying to make that change, especially, for our program, for circles, we really focus on that systemic change. And we want people in our program to know that the systems are broken, because we're not just dealing with, those nonprofit funders, or we're not just dealing with government changes. We're also struggling to support them to navigate mental health care system, a healthcare system, new things that come out, with the certain supports around providing kids under 12 supports for dentistry, things like that, because there's so many different administrative um, uh, like details that have to come along with accessing those supports. So we're constantly trying to navigate the systems ourselves, as well as support other individuals to do so.
Right. So, take a practical example, maybe that Goodwill does such an awesome job at helping people to be trained, find employment, move their way back into social life and other things. However, for groups like you, for groups like Pathways and others,
Mhm.
part of the government support has been things like bus passes and things like that that could help people, because a lot of the work is out in the periphery of London, right? So people have to get on these buses and go. And then, so you build a program that's around that. And then all of a sudden the government might change or something else will happen. They'll say, you know what, we're dropping the busing part of it. And now all of a
Mhm.
sudden you still have the rest of the stuff going on, but disconnecting that person from A to B has now become a huge chasm in the way. And I presume for people that you're assisting, that has brought on a layer of complexity that the rest of us wouldn't understand. We would just grab an Uber or go in a second car and away we go. For this person, it just cut their future off unless they can solve that problem. How do you deal with that when those things happen? Do you go out and look for other funders, or do you try to find a different way of doing things? How do you handle that?
Glenn, that is a good question because that's what we're dealing with day by day right now. We are working super hard. Our career centers are working hard to really understand what the system's going to look like in the next 4 to 5 months, and really being able to communicate that to participants to say, we do have these bus tickets, or we want to make sure that you're getting what you need to get where you need,
Yeah.
especially in the city of London. If you don't have a car, it's so complex. I remember I had a friend many years ago. He said he would walk over one of the overpasses, like almost on the outskirts of London, so that he could get to his factory job. And that's just the reality for a lot of people. And a lot of people will say, you know what, if you just get a job, you'll be fine. You can get
Yeah.
off Ontario Works. And we don't need Ontario Works if you just get a job. Well, it is so much more difficult. We have the way out by White Oak Road. We have, some people call it by the pound, but we have a warehouse out there as well. And we have a lot of individuals who actually work there. That is our largest place of employment. And at one point, we had to advocate for a bus stop to be across the street because we hire a lot of individuals who have barriers and they kind of get their first start there.
Mhm.
And it's a great place to work. We have over 1,200 employees across Ontario, and largely within the within London and Middlesex. And it's not just individuals who are on Ontario Works; it's people who are often working in hourly jobs as well.
Yeah.
But going back to those who are seeing the cuts to their bus passes, yes, I mean it's going to mean going to the food bank versus going to an interview potentially, and then you have to be able to navigate all that, getting the transfer and making sure that you get on the bus to go get your kids at the end of the day. It's a very difficult system to navigate when you are in poverty.
Yeah. I know that a lot of the stuff about poverty is about single males who, struggling and trying to find work, so on and so forth. But the recent Stats Canada stuff that came out, it showed that 60% of Canadian single mothers are food insecure.
Mm.
60%. If they're Indigenous, right, it's even higher. So it's here's a woman, for instance, trying to keep her family together, or it might be a single father who's trying to do it. But how do they do all of that and keep that going? The budget is so tight, they don't wish to come to the food bank, and they don't. And then all of a sudden they come in to Goodwill that day or whatever it is, and they are told that bus passes are no longer a thing that they can count on. Now they have to go back, open up their budget, and figure out how in all the world can I get this done, right? And
Yeah.
so the only way maybe is to come to a food bank. because that might get them enough to help them get through that month. But it's no way to live, right? And it's no way for politicians, I think, to design policies that are meant to help people move their way and navigate their way through the system. When 4 years later, another group comes along with a different kind of ideology and will decide to cut it, or another group might come along and decide to enhance it. I mean, all of that is great, but for people who are involved in trying to help people navigate poverty, it what do you do? It's like whack-a-mole. Every time something comes up, you're trying to stay on top of it and do it. And I presume for you, that's a lot of where the burnout would come. I'm not saying you're burned out, but I know you're exhausted. But I'm sure that's where a lot of it
Yeah.
comes from, is the unknown element that in the future somebody could just come along and wipe that out.
Yeah, that is the difficulty. Part of the reason why, and I've worked in many different jobs, as I mentioned before, but part of the reason why I have been managing the Circles program for the last 7 years is because I truly believe that it takes a very coordinated approach to support individuals. So we work on that system change, which is what we talked about before. And we want to make sure that people who have lived experiences have their voices at tables that will impact that change. That is one truly large aspect we embed. But the other really great thing about this program, and I'm not trying to boost the program or anything, but it is the volunteers. So the whole thought is that we have a coach that supports that individual to navigate these systems, but we also have volunteers who are just like your neighbors. They are
Yeah,
exactly that. They're people who are further along in their career. They've navigated some systems, maybe. They have other networks. And this is how we support individuals is when they can't get to the food bank and maybe the coach is off that day or burnt out or something like that, then their friend from Circles can take them. Or maybe they want to both go grocery shopping and, a single mom doesn't have a car in order to get to the grocery. They'll go to the grocery store together. Or maybe somebody from who has an HR job can talk about during that program, and we do so over a meal, but talk about at that program, the types of questions that they ask when interviewing individuals, or the types of things that you should build your skills around in order to talk to your manager, or how to get a job, or I know this person who has an opening here, or that person, or I can watch your kids while you go for that interview. So it that is the power of what we have been doing. And unfortunately, recently we've had to look for other funding elsewhere because of the changes of the government. So yeah, it exactly what you're saying right now is we got through COVID, we changed our programs, we tried to make sure that everyone was supported, and then this government changed the system, and we are not only exhausted by COVID, but now exhausted by this whole pandemic, and things, as we can see when we drive down the streets, seem to be getting worse. And yes, frontline workers are exhausted, but I do so much appreciate the volunteers, the passion of the volunteers in our program.
yeah,
They really are the breadth of this program, and I'm very grateful. They are the ones that keep us going, and the participants. We had a Christmas party, or a holiday celebration, whatever you want to call it, a big dinner at Goodwill with all of our participants and their kids, and everyone's running around. And it was beautiful just to
yeah,
see the community come together. But we were, because we had funding from a private donor, we were able to give individuals
yeah,
gift cards in order to be able to support their families at Christmas, which was wonderful.
yeah.
So yeah, you have to take the good with the bad.
I know.
But the system is the biggest thorn in our side right now,
Yeah. So I was speaking
unfortunately.
to a business group last week, and
Mhm.
I mentioned that you and I had met, and that as a food bank, we had heard that Circles had gone through some cuts. And
Mhm.
we couldn't understand that because as a food bank, we know that all that we are doing is a person comes in, they spend 10 minutes with us, they get their food, and they're gone. Now they have to answer some questions, they're put in the computer, all of those, but that's it. A group like Circles comes along and it takes on the whole thing, right? It helps that person in all the things that they're into. So for us as a food bank, it's of great concern to us that the people who are the navigators, who are actually helping people not to have to come to the food bank,
Yeah.
are being cut. Because what that ends up meaning is that those people then will have to come to the food bank to make ends meet. So when I said that to this business group that I was speaking to, the one person just said, well, why did they do that? Right? It's true. Just logically, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, if we want to help people get back to work or get over some mental health difficulties that they have had or whatever it is, if we want to help them with those kinds of things, you need to build the supports around those people. We know to do that with the Health and Homeless Summit, right? That the city is getting going. It's all these supports that go around it. But often, if you're a family that's in poverty, you don't have all of that. And
Mhm.
without Circles or other groups like Circles doing all of that, those people are lost. So when you suddenly come along and say to Circles, well, your funding is gone, sorry, right? It affects the rest of us. It affects
Yeah.
groups like the food bank that the public is, just as you have said, the public has been so generous. But we have a responsibility as a food bank to go to the public as well and say, we need the navigators. Without, we're
Mhm.
not navigators as a food bank. Without the navigators, these people will get lost not being able to navigate the system. So I really appreciate what you're doing, but I did say to those folks that day that I'm really looking forward, and Jane is, and the rest of us at the food bank, to partnering with Circles about helping you to get some of the food and do those things. I'm not trying to speak about the food bank per se, but it's just ironic that that's what it has come down to because of cuts, right? That we're having to be so creative and do those kind of things. It's actually going the opposite way to what we would want. We would people to want people to be able to find independence and liberation, and so on and so forth. It just doesn't happen. So it just doesn't make sense to me.
Absolutely. And I think something that we are seeing much more is a lot of housing stability. And that is what's taking a lot of our work hours. And when I say housing stability, I mean supporting people to know what their rights and their responsibilities are as a tenant as we see an increase in rent. And we try to prevent people from becoming homeless. And that's
Yeah,
the prevention is a huge thing that a lot that my staff are doing these days are making sure that people have safe and affordable housing. And a lot of people say, I want to really advocate for affordable housing, but it also needs to be safe. And we need to make sure that people have the choice to live where they want and not just, over there where the government decides that that's where they should live. So
yeah,
I'm a huge advocate for, people having the choice to be able to have that dignity of where to live, where to
yeah,
shop, where to access services. So yeah, housing stability is another huge thing. And there are so many incredible groups doing that work in the city of London. Um, but we also have to make sure that people are not homeless and that aren't becoming homeless as well. And we see that rent just keep on continuing to rise. And again, like we mentioned, Ontario Works is not increasing at all.